Hi everyone and welcome to Module 1. In this module, we'll consider some fundamental understandings of educational research. What is research? How is that different than any other information gathering activity we may engage in every day? We will also begin to consider key questions like, what does it mean to be an ethical researcher? How do we actually do research and for what purpose? The key word here is begin, as most of these questions will be taken up in much greater detail throughout the course. During this module, you will read the first chapter of the Creswell and Guterman text that considers some of these questions. You'll also read pages 154 to 159 in Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco, and an article by Baker that each consider various aspects of observation as a key research method for collecting data. Your first assignment will be to complete Part A of the observation assignment. Your instructions are minimal in Part A on purpose, so that you experience in a small way the kinds of decisions a researcher must make about key aspects of their research. In many ways, this part of the assignment is to raise questions for you that you will consider in more detail in Part B. Once Part A is complete, I will post instructions for Part B of the assignment on eClass. I will also post Part B of the video at the same time. The reasons for this somewhat mysterious approach to this assignment will become clear, I promise. If it's at all possible, I would also suggest that you wait to read Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco, as well as Baker, after you submit your observation submit your assignments on eClass. And I think in that way you'll benefit most from this assignment. In keeping with that request, this video will deal only with the concepts in the Creswell and Guterman, and Part B of the video will become later on Sunday, January 9th, to assist you with the requirements of Part B of the assignment. So Part B of the assignment and Part B of the video will both be posted later Sunday on January the 9th. Okay, so let's learn a little bit about the authors of the texts you're going to be spending so much time with in Edu 510. 3 authors have contributed to the 7th edition of Designing Qualitative Research. Marshall is the William Eves Distinguished Emerita Professor in Leadership and Policy, who spent many years teaching and researching at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. The focus of her work has been an interdisciplinary approach to study schools' cultures, state policy cultures, as well as gender and social justice issues. I've personally found her scholarship not only extraordinarily useful in my own, but I am one of legions of scholars who have benefited from her scholarship in the politics of education and educational administration and leadership, and her many awards attest to that. She's one of few who have looked at the issues around done research in the area of vice principals. So if some of you are considering that, I would suggest looking at her work around that. Rossman was actually one of Marshall's students, and her interests center around educational reform, internationally and domestically, particularly in higher education. She's also recognized internationally for her expertise in qualitative research methodology. Blanco, who is originally from Mexico, was a student of Rossman's, and like her, has a keen interest in international education and global social justice. And he is interested in how higher education institutions define, improve, and communicate their value to stakeholder groups. He has consulted internationally and worked with many countries in developing quality standards for higher education, and has lived as well as researched the experience of international students who study in the U.S. All 3 authors at various points in their careers are recognized as outstanding qualitative research practitioners and scholars, whether they're beginning, continuing, or retired experts. John Creswell, one of the original authors and of all of the editions of Educational Research Planning, Conducting and Evaluating Qualitative and Quantitative Research, was for years a professor of educational psychology at the University of Nebraska, an area of study that is largely informed by qualitative analysis. He saw the usefulness, however, of qualitative work to expand on and fill in the gaps of quantitative research, and was the first and most influential proponent of what he called mixed methods. He developed the conceptual and theoretical framework for mixed methods, and it's an approach that has been taken up in many academic disciplines because of its utility and its ability to provide a more fulsome exploration of a phenomenon. Creswell is now an adjunct professor at the University of Michigan and works with medical faculty to teach mixed methods as well as consult nationally and internationally. Tim Guterman is also a specialist in mixed methodology. He's also at the University of Michigan and works across disciplines and internationally with collaborators in mixed methods. He is particularly interested in research at the intersection of health and education and the improvement of health services. I really tried to find out more about Linda M. Baker. Particularly, I tried to find a picture. She's the author of the excellent article on observation as a research method that you've been assigned for this module. But even deep into a Google search, I couldn't find a picture anywhere. Facebook, didn't matter what I looked. So I don't know, they don't seem to exist. However, we do know that she did or does teach in the School of Library and Information Science at Wayne State University in Michigan. And she has very active research history and information finding in health sciences and social sciences, particularly information communication between doctors and patients, with an emphasis on patients with multiple sclerosis. She has also published several books with international scholars looking at information-seeking behaviors and the needs of sex workers. The article we'll be looking at is a rich and deeply researched paper on observation as a useful method, particularly in qualitative research. So let's have a look at what these authors help us to understand more fully about the nature and practice of research. In Part A, we'll be looking mostly at Creswell and Guterman, as well as observation as a method for collecting data in Part B, where we'll be looking at Baker and Marshall et al. At the heart of the course are three questions. What is research? And implied by that question, what is not research? And how do we do research well? As Creswell and Guterman argue, research is a linear process in which the researcher poses a question, collects data to answer that question, and then presents data to answer the question. And that is true. However, research, I would argue, and Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco demonstrate in the totality of their text, that research is more complex than this definition would suggest. In addition to what Creswell and Guterman suggest, I would argue that research is a systematic, theoretically informed, and ethical examination of a particular phenomenon in a social context. And I think this encompasses all of the things more definitively that a researcher needs to be thinking about. As educators, as researchers in education, our primary interest is in educational practices, organizations, stakeholders, and often the interactions within and between them. As we'll learn in the third module in much more detail, research practices and approaches, of which there are many, and Creswell and Guterman introduce you to some of them in Chapter 1, are informed by theories that are represented in the methods used to explore the social phenomenon under inquiry. Those methodologies appear under two main paradigms with their own philosophical roots and theoretical characteristics. Creswell and Guterman explore this further in Chapter 1 in excellent detail, and we're going to pick this up in further detail in Module 3 and beyond. So if this is what research is, what does this mean that research is not? Research, whether qualitative or quantitative, is not merely opinion, it is not simply reporting, it is not common sense. Research may confirm previous knowledge, or what some see as common sense, but importantly, it offers opportunities for seeing differently, understanding more deeply, and understanding or being able to explain something in a more complex way. Research is a process that involves multiple steps that are not necessarily linear, but do build on one another over time. And these steps are used to analyze information to increase our understanding of the topic or issue. These steps are discussed in Creswell and Guterman, and they include identifying a problem, which we'll be looking at in Module 2, and you'll be doing an assignment around identifying the problem you're going to be looking at, or you think you might be looking at. Pose a question in relation to that problem. Review the literature to see what the literature actually says about that question and that problem. And here's where you may start to, may revisit and rework some of the work that you've already done in relation to the literature. And that's what I mean by it's not necessarily linear. You're going to then specify a purpose for the research based on all of what has happened previously. You're going to collect data in relation to the purpose of your research and the question you're trying to answer. and you're going to analyze and interpret that data using a whole variety of methods within the methodology that you've chosen, and then you're going to report and evaluate that research. So this is how we do research well. Now, each of these steps is complex in its own way. And as we go through the course, we'll be talking about, and in many ways you'll be experiencing many of these steps as we go through, so that none of it is going to be a big surprise when you're doing your own research as you move through the program. And why do we do research? That's the last question we need to consider at this point. Why should we research at all? Creswell and Guterman provide an answer, and I'd like to add my own take on the importance of research. I'm sure you could add to this list, but here are some thoughts about the purposes of research, particularly educational research. So it helps us to understand the world in which we live, how it's organized, how our actions affect others within that organization or outside of that organization, how we can live well with others, not just in our own little bubble, but with others in complex groupings in educational settings. How can we come to know the other? How can we work more efficiently and effectively with all of those that we are engaged with and want to do well for? It helps us to develop policies and governance at the local, provincial, national, and international level that work well in achieving the common good through social institutions like educational institutions. It helps us consider our practices at various institutional levels, its effectiveness, its efficiency, the experience of actually engaging in these practices, and so on. And it influences at multiple levels of organizations and society. So it might be at the micro level between just a couple of people, meso level and a grouping like a school or a community, macro level like the larger community that is like a province, for example, or federally or even internationally. So of course, research can happen anywhere, as these pictures suggest. But how do we actually do research? Well, as the Baker and Marshall and the Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco readings demonstrate, one of the most common forms of research is observation. The dictionary tells us that observation is the action or process of observing something or someone carefully in order to gain information. For example, she was brought into the hospital for observation. You'll notice key words here. It's an action. It's a process. It's not simply stepping back and kind of just staring. Rather, you're actively engaged in what it is that you are observing. You're engaged in observing something or someone carefully in order to gain information. So there are many ways in which you can do that through watching, monitoring, scrutinizing, and examining, and so on. So as you're doing part A of your observation assignment this week and then posting it in the Submit Your Assignment section of eClass, I'd like you to reflect on your own definition of observation in relation to the context in which you collect your data. I'll be reading your assignment with great interest. I always love reading these, and will provide feedback as soon as possible as you complete part B of the assignment the following week. Just be sure that the location for your observation is public, like a coffee shop, skating arena, shopping mall, etc., where as much as possible you are unknown, and I know that might be difficult in some locations, or you can kind of fade into the background, and that the participants as much as possible are unknown. Please follow COVID protocols carefully, and if you have any questions at all, please let me know. All the best.